Do you want to say anything? That you had some like opening
Just
words of
opening
wisdom.
note, thanks no wisdom. Just thanks everybody for coming to the session and being patient with us as we had these technical difficulties with the passcode. Again, wanted to thank our friends Rich and Bill from BrightVine, our partner for this BB Dev Days, our sponsor, I should say. So at this point, I'm just going to turn it over to Rich.
Sounds good. Sounds good. And I'm actually probably just going to turn it over to Bill first, since I'm going to be talking the majority of the time. So I'll give him a few minutes to actually say something. So why
I
don't you
get
go
to get
ahead,
a
Bill?
few words in to start. This is a little bit of a companion session to yesterday's conversation on practical applications of AI from the business side and building out sort of a prototype and a demonstration. And then today is the deep dive, kind of hands-on coding segment. So I probably talked 80% yesterday and Rich 20, and today I'll talk 2% and Rich will run the whole show. If I could get a quick set of reactions, how many people were able to come to our the session Rich and I did yesterday? Maybe just give a thumbs up or a quick note for us if anyone saw that. It's not a prerequisite. It's not a requirement. Just trying to get, yeah, okay. So we at least have some sense that some of you were there. Rich and I both represent BrightVine. We're here today to share with you kind of the deep dive technical. If you saw this yesterday, but just a quick note about BrightVine, we're a technical services company as well as a strategic services company. We work primarily with Blackbaud CRM and sort of larger enterprise-oriented customers, but we really do run the gamut of including Razor's Edge, some services delivery, as well as really growing our AI and machine learning practice as we build it out either into client-specific scenarios and models, or working on products that might come to market in a way that more customers could consume. And we really see ourselves as trying to help get ahead of the curve with some of the AI and ML, and then show you what we've learned. And if you watched the session yesterday, it's kind of unpacking what is the story that's unfolding, and how do you use the tools, and what could you do to roll up your own sleeves and get your hands on and take care of that. So Rich, I think that might be it for me, right?
Yeah, I think that's it for you. Yes. All right. Well, hi everybody. Nice to see the people that were there yesterday. As Bill mentioned, this is an extension a little bit of that call of the meeting we had yesterday, with really the goal today of trying to give you something practical, right? Some code that at the end of this you'll be able to take away from it. Use it for whatever you want to use it for, and to be honest, it'd be great to even hear some stories as to what you use it for. It is some simple examples, right, of how to do a few of the things on the screen that we have here, and really kind of walk you through a little bit of a thought process on how we go and put one of these to these integrations, or I would say global changes at this point in place. And so the use cases that I kind of want to go through today specifically are these three that you see on the screen here. So the first is sort of the trusted and true sentiment analysis one, and I want to go back and talk about this one just so that you can get a sense of how we call an ML.NET package, how we use that within CRM, but more specifically, what are the things that you need to do, right, in order to say tomorrow just use something and generate a sentiment analysis attribute or in your database. The second is we're going to use ChatGPT and show some examples, right, of how we use that for a multitude of different reasons. One, to look at essentially and analyze a contact report, right? And really what we want to do here is to look at enforcing some of our best practices that we might have defined and have that run against an existing contact report that we might have. And then thirdly, as we're going through this whole process, right, how do we use something like a ChatGPT, right, to help us write some code and things like that. So that's the goal essentially for today. Given that we have a pretty small group of people, and I think this session is actually limited to it's like 30 or below or something like that. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. I will try to answer them as I see them pop up on my screen on the left here. But otherwise, I will try to go through everything. I know we have a pretty shortened window up until 5 to kind of go through all this. So we'll go ahead and do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is why don't we take a look at what I'm talking about and really kind of look at it in practice and how it actually would work. So on the screen here, we have in CRM, right? We have Bill Walsh's record at the top here. Now, there's two things on this record. One is a contact report, and the other one is just an interaction. Okay, so if I go to this first one here, you can see, for example, should it open up, that this interaction is here. It just basically says, I love machine learning from Bill. I wish I could have machine learning change my life so he can bike and travel. And more specifically, and I think the more importantly, is send Doritos to me, because if anybody wants to win favor with me, send me a bag of Doritos. I got you. But you can see here, nothing on here, no attributes. Likewise, if we go to some of this other interaction for his contact report, right? This is basically one that says, I met with Bill last week, right? And I thought about giving some money to my annual trip here. So I have two global changes and that's what we're going to review today as part of this process. Now I did queue them up in here so that I could just run them, and I can show you that this is working. So the first one is a global change that actually is going to create create the sentiment analysis components and attributes on Bill's record. The second is going to be a process that reaches out to ChatGPT, right, and actually goes ahead and takes that contact report and returns back its thoughts on the actual contact report that we're talking about. Okay, so the answer is not roasted corn, and the answer is absolutely nacho cheese. I'm a purist when it comes to my Doritos. However, I don't pass up. The only one I don't like is like the mustard flavor and ketchup one. So going to this first one here, letter from Bill. So we look at this here. We have this attribute. And you can see here under this attribute, it created an attribute here that says sentiment, right? And this says it's a positive sentiment with a probability of 90%. Okay, so I agree with that, right? And so when we talk about this in a little bit, I'll talk about how we actually make this work. Now going back to the other one here, just so you have a sense, we have this contact report. I met with Bill last week to discuss giving money, et cetera, et cetera. And the response back from ChatGPT around this created basically a documentation or an interaction note on here. And this note basically responded back with something that says there's areas of improvement required for this, right? The report doesn't include title, fundraiser, and you can kind of read through that, and we'll talk through what this is specifically doing, okay? So our goal for today is actually just to review how these two global changes were actually created, and the sort of the process and the thought process behind how they were built. And then show you the code. This will not be this will go through sections of the code. We're not going to write all the code together today. We don't have that kind of time. However, we will step on and look at specific little pieces of that in there, okay? Now, this brings us to how did this all happen, right? How did we get to a point of, like, how did ChatGPT know that this is what we wanted to sort of talk about, right? And this is a good time for where we talk about the business use cases. Right. And so the business use cases here are, when we talk to some of our partners, some of your peers and what have you, right, is an area where we essentially would say, what is it that we need to enforce? What are the rules that we want to enforce? What are the things that we want to actually have ChatGPT tell us about and talk to us about, right, as it relates to these contact reports, right? And so we had actually worked with our peer at Virginia Tech. And they basically furnished us with some of their logic that they use when they're actually writing contact reports themselves. So we're going to use that in terms of what we do, in the future state here. Okay. But in the meantime, what I want to do is actually take you through the first part of this, right? And that's the sentiment analysis piece. And we're going to look through some of the code and how we do that. All right. So sentiment analysis and our vision for how this all works and how we use it, right, is going to use something called the binary classification algorithm, right? So that is 0 and a 1. That means that it's either, in our use case, negative or positive, right? In order to do that, we need a training set. And what I wanted to first show everybody on the call, and many of you may already know some of these things, you may know pieces of it, but I wanted to kind of walk you through, if you're essentially new to this, right? Where can I go? What can I do? How do I actually get involved with this? Well, here's a training set for sentiment analysis, right? And you look at this, it says something like, wow, I love this place. That's a 1, right? So when we look at these features and labels, as they're called, right, where our feature is this, wow, love this place, and our label is, that's a 1, right? Crust is not good. That's a 0, right? So you can see that what this is telling us in this data set as we scroll down, right, is I've given it here's a line, here's a sentence, here's a phrase. This is good, this is bad, this is positive, this is negative, that whole thing. Now, clearly, I did not go and type all this out, right? I didn't go go through this list and figure that out. So I wanted to point everybody to, if you haven't already used such a service or a website, is a website called Kaggle. So this is a tool and a website that many people use in the ML space, right, to actually grab existing sets of data that they can use, right, in order to play with or use some of these ML components. Now, the data, can you trust it? For the most part, I'd say yes, but cautious, verify. When it comes down to your data and we start to look at that, we're going to look at things like going through and having somebody first look through a list of all of your interactions. Was this good? No. Was this or positive? Yes. Was it not positive? Negative, right? And those might be where you have to train your own data set based on your own intuition as to how the donor might look. But that said, what we did was to use an existing set of data in order to process that there. Okay. So as we move on to then, what are we doing with this, right? I'm going to bring us over to Visual Studio now, okay? And hopefully everybody can see this on my screen. But what we have here is essentially a global change, right? This is specifically a CLR global change within Blackbaud CRM, right? So all this code is in C#, right? And in here, we basically have 3 different methods that we're calling. So in the global change itself, if we go back to the UI, you'll actually see, there's basically 3 options that we have in the front. Right. The first is to actually create and train a model. The second being to actually add all the interactions, so upsert those interaction attributes. And the third is just the process to delete all the existing ones. That way we can do a clean sweep of all the actual attributes. The first part here, which is largely very important, right, is that we go into the actual, we grab the data from that file, right? This is this load data routine that we have in here. And it is just a file stream, right? It's actually pulling that data from the file and reading it into memory. You notice here that this says train test data. Well, this is an actual object that is included within the ML.NET libraries. If we scroll out to the top of this code, we'll see that we're actually using Microsoft's ML libraries up here at the top, and then we can actually add and create their objects within our code here. Now, what this process then does is to call a method that we have that says build and train model, and we're passing into it, right, our training set, which is what we just created up here. All right. Now, that loading of the data and that training of the data is specifically calling essentially Microsoft's trainer, right? So this code, don't get too hung up on this. You can kind of look at this and look at examples, and you'll have this for future reference, et cetera. But the important part that I will bring you here, right, is to note that it is calling one specific model, right, which is this binary classification model. Okay. So what it does, it runs for a couple minutes based on the data set, right? And essentially builds a binary object that we afterwards go ahead and save into the database. So the next step in our process is essentially to save this. We call a stored procedure that we have that actually saves this as a binary object in a table so that we can reference it later on. Or if we had multiple data sets, for instance, we could actually train multiple data sets at a time in order to work with it. One of the processes that we are working on here at BrightVine, and we can talk about this in either at the end of this or later on, is a process that allows us to test different models, save a whole bunch of different models based on our current data, and then help us to identify which model is actually bringing back the best results. And part of that is training those models, saving them, and then running tests against them in order to check their accuracy. After we've essentially done all that, then we follow our next step, which is basically insert and hit the model right up with our upsert. And that part is actually, I think, relatively straightforward in terms of what we're doing. So we're basically pulling from a procedure, right, that actually pulls all of the actual interactions that we want to use. So it's basically everything from the interaction table, right, where the interaction flag is 1. And we're going ahead and just looping through and calling this procedure. Now, we'll note, the only thing of note in here that's probably worth noting is that the way that the object returns back its prediction, right, is either a positive percentage or a negative, but the number comes back with just one value. So, for instance, if this is actually a negative sentiment, it might say 90 as well. But if it says a positive one, it says 90 as well. So it's basically telling us a number on each part of a range. And when it does give us a flag that says this is negative or this is positive, or rather it says false or true. And based on that, we can basically say, well, if it's negative, then it's 1 minus, right, to get the negative sentiment. And if it's positive, it's just whatever that is on the other side. So again, this is basically just the way that we are actually grabbing and showing and displaying that number. But we end up coming back with 2 flags that come back from this prediction that tells us the answer to this. Okay. And then afterwards, we actually save this here. So this code itself is actually relatively straightforward. If you were to look at this and try to run with it as it is, and you wanted to actually add your own flavor of this, your own version of it, right? Then you could easily go ahead and swap out, for instance, the actual trainer that we're using or the actual model we're using and try different variations. You can actually have it pass in multiple features and labels, and you can essentially modify the area that we have for building and training the model, and then change the and use this for your own purposes. Okay. So this is I would say, interesting part. I said the less flashy kind of cool stuff, but it actually ultimately, I think when we look at where we are with machine learning and really what's going to change sort of how we fundraise and everything else, it's going to be largely a lot from these machine learning algorithms and being able to determine and use them to answer questions that we have. Okay. Any questions, just high level on that? I know we have since we have a smaller audience, I'll just kind of open it up anyway, just in case anybody has a question. All right. So the next thing, and probably the more fun part of the conversation, right, is when we start to go into the concepts of using ChatGPT, right, for actually doing some things within CRM, right. Likewise, for the machine learning component, we're going to use a global change. Right. And as you saw in the example, the global change is essentially just writing back to the documentation, interaction documentation note in order to kind of display the feedback that it had. The way that we actually went around doing this, right, is first to go down the path of there's 2 sets of data we really want to provide to ChatGPT in order for it to answer these questions. The first one is sort of prompts, right? Those are the things that we're asking it to do, essentially setting it up to say, we want to say that, for instance, a nonprofit, contact report, right, has the following key pieces of information, right? The who, the why, the where, the what, right? Those are the information that we want to provide to it so it knows what to think about. Secondarily, what we're sending it is a couple of examples, right? So this helps prime the information so that we actually can get back more logical results. Now, in the example that we're using here, the priming of actual examples is less of a requirement, because really what this would be useful for is if we told it, give me back a contact report in the same vein as what we have here. But it can't hurt, right, to provide that information to ChatGPT. So what we're essentially doing, and I'll show you first within ChatGPT itself, right, is we're going to prompt it with a few things. And then I'll take you to the API component of this and how we actually set that up. So the first thing I'll do, and I have it already copy and paste this, right, is I take some of that information that we have there, and I basically have something that says a nonprofit, a good nonprofit report, contact report is good if it answers the following questions. Great. Now, what I normally would do, and when I actually am using this, is I actually do tell it, just so it doesn't get verbose on me at the end, I actually just add a line in here that says reply only with reply only with red. That way it doesn't actually start filling out a whole bunch of other things for me. Secondarily, then I go back to the examples, right? And I can feed it the examples here, and I can tell it, here's an example of a bunch of contact reports that look good, and tell me it's red. So then here's the ask, right? This is the part where I basically say, based on this information here, what areas of improvement do we see, right? So this is a simple thing. It just says, Rich expressed he wanted to make a gift, yada, 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 right? So if I were to send this here, then the tool will come back and it'll actually say, you did not include the title for Rich. You did not do these following components here, right? Here are all the areas that we could have improved upon this report based on your criteria before. So you think about this, how you would use this in the future. right? You could go back and the tie to your actual business users, right, is to say, maybe we haven't been writing this stuff down, or maybe we have, but maybe now is a good time to articulate specifically, right, what we want this machine to basically be able to tell us, right? And go back to your, major gift officers, go back to whoever's running those departments and basically say, tell me that list so that we can try to apply these rules to these contact reports. Now, what you saw here, what you're seeing here with the global change is certainly useful. What will be more useful in the future, right? And something that will eventually have some code to do, right? Is interactive validation, right? As you're typing it into a form, right? You go in here and they start typing in their contact report live. They hit a validate button and it automatically goes back and responds back with this information. But for simplicity's sake, I went with the global change just for today. Okay. So that means now, how do we take this then and make this work in the actual code itself? Well, it's actually kind of a multi-step process as well. And it's only a multi-step process because I'm trying to accelerate the development of this as opposed to us just typing all this code in ourselves. All right. So I'll take you over here first, over to the actual global change itself. Okay. In fact, I lied. I'm going to take you first over to Postman. And I think most people on this call are probably familiar with it. You may or may not. Right. But this is essentially a tool that allows us to send, JSON or even, requests to an API and get back the information. Right. So, and this is an example of calling out to the actual API. Right. So the ChatGPT API, and there's a couple of them that are out there. But for this one, we're actually calling something called the Chat Completions API. And basically, we're telling it what model we want to use. We're using the cheaper one for this call, which is the 3.5 version. The ChatGPT 4 model has a different pricing structure. Doesn't really matter. The temperature, this is just a setting, and we're not going to go into too much detail about it, but it basically changes how the response comes back. Almost consider it to say 0 is the least playful, and up to 2 is the let me get artistic with my response. That's how I would essentially look at that. And then the message, right? What's the content of the message and who's the person? So I'm the user, and here's my question. So in order to set this up in our and to really kind of streamline how we build our global change, what we want to actually do is be able to more easily write this request, right, and write this response, right, and kind of deal with the response that we get back, rather than trying to essentially decode the JSON that comes back and try to piece it together. So what we end up doing is essentially creating a series of classes, right? And these classes look something like this, right? So we have a class for the response. We have a class for a subpart of the response, which you saw in here, and I'll just bring this up next to it, right? Where one of the subclasses to the response is a sub node, but then becomes another subclass, right? Is a choice. And then within there's a message, and that's essentially in the content. And those are just nested values. So using Newtonsoft's JSON deserializer, we can actually make that work sort of more automated. Now, for those that haven't worked with this before, certainly you can go in here and type all this out. Not a big deal, right? You can go and look at this and say, well, I have this object here, and I have a sub component to that as well. That said, I think the easier way and a tool that we use all the time here, especially when we're building custom business processes within Blackbaud CRM, is to use an app or a web app that's called QuickType.io. There's a bunch of them. You can use JSON to C#, bunch of things like that. But it allows you essentially to take the response and the request, and it will generate all of this for you, right? So you don't have to go and code it. You don't have to do it. It properly does all the nesting of, these are subclasses that go to these classes, et cetera. And we can essentially take this code as is, copy it, and paste it right into our process here. Okay. So now what this gives us is essentially something that says, I have a place where the code, where essentially my response and can come back and be in an object of some sort, which then allows me to do something like say, new response equals, rich dot this dot choice dot message dot content. It allows me to get to it much easier. And you can see that up here, right? When we go up to this call that we do here at the top of my code up here. So when we're actually in the global change itself, we're going to go ahead and call our little procedure. So we process the global change. We call just a sub method, right? And this sub method in here is calling our SQL stored procedure. Okay. So this SQL store procedure that we're talking about, right, is basically pulling all the contact reports that we have in the system. Now, I specifically have it coded to use just one, which is bills, because I don't want to send them all to ChatGPT right now and run up my bill. But that said, this is what this SQL is doing. But I wanted to call attention to one thing on here, because if you remember in our scenario before when we were actually in ChatGPT, right, we basically said we need to prompt it with a few questions before we can actually ask it to give us back anything, right? And those prompts were, here's the list of the examples, right? And here is the questions that I want answered as part of that prompt. So what we've done, and when this example, right, is we created a table, right? And that table is a list of prompts, right? So what this is going to do is in here, I've got all of my prompts that I potentially might want, right? So as you're coding something for the future that might actually use a selection, we could say, this is for contact reports, this is for something else, right? I can basically say, I'm planning to submit a contact report, call the following prompts and add those to the request to ChatGPT, right? That is what this query over here is doing. When I pull from the database, right, I'm basically saying, get me all the interactions where the contact report is a contact report. Get me this specific one because I only want to send this one, but you would essentially remove this or have a selection based on it. And then use the stuff command to essentially grab all the prompts and append it to the actual contact report, right, that was actually on Bill's record. So now we've essentially simulated that we've put all this together, right, into one message that we're going to send over to ChatGPT. Okay. Once we're back here, right, and we go back to our code piece here, then we have a couple more steps, right? So the step is to loop through it, right? And we essentially are going to call an instance of our little object that we created. We're going to call our function that I'm going to show you in a second, which takes in 2 parameters, right? It takes in an API key, which is what you can get if you go on the actual ChatGPT website and you sign up for an account. If you go under the account settings, you'll see an area where you can sign up and get an API key. Then it basically passing in the information related to the interaction. And that information, that interaction is the combined message that we're going to send to ChatGPT, right? It is the combination of the prompts, the combination of the contact report, right? And that's what we're going to essentially push out there, okay? Now, we can go in here and we can basically call the web service. Right, so we create a new instance of our ChatGPT request object. We give it some of the little parameters that we have here. We essentially set the content, right, to be the content from the report. We call the actual, we basically call the actual URL and pass in the request. And then basically, if the response comes back yay or nay, meaning the status is good or bad, then we respond back. We write back the errors, or we go ahead and create this response object, which then fills in all of the response from ChatGPT, which is what you saw in the screen. The second step to that then is to actually save this AI response, to actually save this to that note. We call the save AI response routine here, which is essentially just calling another stored procedure. And what we're passing into it is basically the ID of the interaction that we're playing with and the response that we got from ChatGPT. Then we're just appending that onto that in there. Okay. Now, you may say to yourself, all right, I'm new to playing with ChatGPT. I'm new to using all of this. I don't know how to call an API, right? This is where, when we talk about being able to use ChatGPT itself, right, to help us, we can do that, right? So let's take this example here for a moment, right? I'm going to basically feed into ChatGPT. I'm going to tell it the following stuff. The following is our model, right? And I'll actually show it to you on this here. I have this here. I'm going to paste this in so you can see it, right? This is our model for a response. This is our model for the request, right? Based on this, I want you to create a method called call ChatGPT, which basically calls this a URL. It has in it a string as a parameter called API key and a string for a parameter called contact report text. and it uses this request above. Okay. And what I'm going to do is paste this in here. And what will come out of it is the actual code that we have in here. Okay. So you can see here that basically it is giving us a sample, exactly almost what we have in the code here. Now, the interesting thing about it is maybe, if we look at this code, you can see it says async and what have you. So it's trying to call this asynchronously. Maybe what we want to do is not do that, right? So the benefit of being able to, of this code generation component, right, is that we can go in here and basically say something, you know what? I know it's not best practice, but go ahead and change this exact code and make it not asynchronous, right? And it will go back and rewrite this whole thing using our model, using our, basically all the things that we provided here. And this code can be essentially copy and pasted into our code itself and generated in and pasted in here. Now, is it the end all be all? No, right? Is it meaning that if we were to paste this in there, it's going to work 100% off the bat? No, right? Maybe. It depends on the scenario. But what I would say is what might have taken us a process of days to test and work through, right, can bring us, we can get example code in here, right, that actually reduces the amount of work effort, by half or a quarter or, even more than that, depending on what we have here. Okay. This whole piece of code that we did here, all this piece here to actually load, to actually call the GPT engine, all those kinds of pieces, took about 3 hours with testing to do, right? Think about like what you would have done if you had paid somebody to go, a vendor or whatever to go and do this, right? You can now do this on your own. And in fact, you can use this as the basis for that. If you looked at this code here and said, actually, I want to change how this save API response works, you could take that, copy it into ChatGPT and say, actually, my procedure name is this. It takes in these 4 parameters, update this to do that. And it will spit out at least a version that might work, or at least get you closer. Okay.
And Rich, just to comment on that, from yesterday's sort of concerns, I think from the larger group was kind of a sense that ChatGPT is going to take my job, is one fear, I think. And I think one of the things we try to think about from that, particularly in code generation, is it's not replacing, it's augmenting, it's making it faster, it's improving the performance and time to live and the quantity of output, but it's nowhere near really finishing everything in a polished way from start to finish. Is that fair?
I think that is a fair statement. Yes. I mean, even in my experimenting with all these pieces, it definitely is one of those, there are opportunities for it to generate code. Sometimes it doesn't do exactly what you want it to do. So it doesn't mean that a developer doesn't need to review what it's doing, right? It only knows so far as what you've told it. And where things get a little bit less useful, right, is if we said, hey, ChatGPT, create me a global change that updates interactions for all records, with this criteria. Well, it doesn't know the database schema, right? It doesn't know, everything about your data and any sort of exceptions that might pop out of that. What are the foreign key constraints that exist? All those kinds of things that it doesn't know, right? So what this is really useful for, I think, is really getting you from I don't want to sit there and type all this code out to I just need to polish it up, right? We've had a couple of examples now when we use Java, things like that are gnarly to code like JavaScript, right? Where I want to put something into an iframe and in a UI model, and I need to type out all this stuff. Well, ChatGPT knows more than just SQL and knows more than just C#, right? We actually had an example of a developer do that last week, where they just basically told it, I have this value that's coming from here, create me something that populates this iframe, and there we go. Now we have a starting point for that, right? And it gets us to a closer point than we were before when we started. So, all right. I know I've tried to rush through some of these stuff because I know we're out of time, and this is a short session. In the future, we are going to look at having sort of a more lengthy session about some of these things as well.
Hey, Rich, actually, there's no one on after us. So you've got time if you so desire, and if we have people on the call who want to stick around. So it's up to you if you want to go over just by a little bit. There is that.
Sure. Time. Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, I think probably I'd open up for questions, right? And we'll ask questions if anybody has anything, other things that we've done in the past with this. The code here will all be put into GitHub. We have a repository that we'll share with the group so that you can grab this code and use it. I would ask that if you do use it and and you feel inclined, not mandatory, but we'd love to hear the kinds of things that you're doing, right? Like what kinds of different tools are you using this as a basis for, and what are you calling GPT for, and what are you? We'd love to kind of hear more sort of thoughts on that. I guess really, I think Bill kind of spoke through most of these, right? But just sort of final thoughts here. ML that is going to give us a lot of opportunities, and it has been. You see it everywhere. You don't even know that it's happening most of the time, right? When we're on Facebook and everything else, but it's giving us a lot of opportunities, at least in our market as well, to start to take conventional queries, right, and make them more robust. ChatGPT itself, is a viable tool, right? But we must be cautious, right? We should always assume that everything, for instance, that I just pasted into those prompts, right, is now public, right? People they may use it for training their models, et cetera. So just be cautious with what you actually put out there. But hopefully at least this gives you a little bit of an overview. I didn't want to complicate things too much. I want to give you some basic code, right? So you can take this tomorrow and say, well, all I want to do is create an attribute, I can do that. And then afterwards I can make it do more, right? I can take that code and move it into a UI model. I can take that code and put it into something else. So hopefully people had, this was at least useful for some people on the call. So
and
Rich, open it up. Any questions?
Just to add to that, two things you all could think about. I know privacy has come up a couple of times, but we're testing with the public ChatGPT because we're not using any sensitive data. It's super cheap, and all that Rich is doing gives us a chance to kind of learn and quickly prototype. But there are really so many options, from Microsoft's ability to deploy a private instance of ChatGPT into Azure Cognitive Services on a per client basis. So any of you could take advantage, for example, of significant Microsoft nonprofit discounts on that type of private cloud approach, because they are really giving it away to nonprofits. And that really helps remove some of the privacy concerns. I was talking to the robotics group, crowd robotics, that is doing the session before this, and they offered their clients an option to use the public chat or private chat that's instant. So just there are ways that we can get through that privacy, even something like private ChatGPT that anonymizes data. So I feel good that we're going to be able to get there. We're just going to have to add more as we get closer to real. But Rich, the options are there.
Absolutely. 100%. All right, so we're right at time. I got you guys to exactly 5:00. We don't have to go anywhere. If there's questions, that people have, or if you want more details or thoughts, certainly come off mute and chit chat with us. Or not.
All right, I have a question.
Okay.
So you were sending one interaction at a time.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to be able to send multiple interactions, can you tag each with an ID that'll return to you? How do you track which?
So are you asking if we're going to send say 10 interactions,
Mm-hmm.
we would send them as separate calls, right?
Okay.
So in the loop in the code, I'll bring it back here. What we're essentially doing is tagging every time we call this GPT, basically go through this loop. We're actually keeping the GUID of the interaction that we're sending,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then we're calling out with that interaction, holding on to the interaction ID, and it would be a separate call for each one. We probably wouldn't bundle them in bulk because there's not really a great way for the GPT engine to actually read it and say, well, actually segment out this one and this one. There might be through some prompting, right? We might be able to say separate it by ID and what have you. But then we get into a scenario of needing to actually parse through that afterwards, which might be a little bit gnarlier. I will say that in all my testing, using this, so I've probably run this process in anticipation of this day, I'd say 50, 60, 100 times, at this point. And me testing it, just go send. Oh, that's wrong. Let's go send. And mostly because I, just checking on certain things. And when I looked at the log of how much it cost me to do that, it basically said 1 cent.
Yeah. Okay.
So sending it, I think, sending 1,000, 5,000, 50,000, right? You're not going to be cost prohibitive. The responses back are relatively quick. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other thoughts, questions? Yeah, well explained. It's probably because it's 5 o'clock on a Wednesday. Everybody's like, let me go. Your time. So
Well, thank you so much, Rich, and
Of course.
Bill, also for sharing all this great content and material. I was fascinated myself, so I think a lot of folks were. Saw some good comments in the chat. So for those who are still here, this session has been recorded, and the link will be available in the Event Hub